The morning Maggie Thompson watched her father collapse in the bakery, she knew her life in Marfa, Texas, would never be the same again. She caught him before his head hit the flour-dusted floor, his breathing shallow and his face ashen gray. The heat of the September morning in 1883 making everything feel more suffocating. The doctor arrived within the hour, his expression grave as he examined her father's weakened heart. And when he finally looked at Maggie with pity in his eyes, she understood that the burden of running Thompson's bakery now rested entirely on her 20-year-old shoulders. Her father had been the heart of their small business, the one who kneaded the dough before dawn and delivered bread to the elderly folks scattered throughout the dusty streets of Marfa. Her mother had passed 3 years prior from consumption, leaving just the two of them to manage. Now, as her father lay in the upstairs bedroom, too weak to descend the narrow stairs, Maggie faced the reality that she would have to do everything herself or watch their livelihood crumble like stale cornbread. The first week tested her resolve in ways she had not anticipated. Waking at 3 in the morning left her dizzy with exhaustion, and her arms ached from mixing the heavy dough. But she persisted, driven by the knowledge that elderly customers like Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Calloway depended on their daily deliveries. These were people who could no longer leave their homes easily, whose children had moved away or died, who waited by their windows for the sight of someone who remembered they existed. On the 8th morning of her new routine, as she loaded the wooden crates of bread into the back of their old wagon, a figure emerged from the pearl-gray dawn. He was tall and lean, with sandy hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore dusty riding clothes and a hat that had seen better days, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to long hours in the saddle. "Morning, miss," he said, his voice warm and tinged with a drawl that suggested roots somewhere further south. "Name is Fletcher Faulkner. I have been watching you load that wagon for the past 3 mornings from the boarding house across the way, and I cannot in good conscience watch you struggle alone another day." Maggie straightened, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was not accustomed to strange men offering assistance, and her first instinct was suspicion. "I manage just fine on my own, mister." "I am sure you do," Fletcher said, and there was no mockery in his tone, only genuine respect. "But managing and thriving are 2 different things. I am between jobs at the moment, looking for ranch work, and I've got time on my hands. Let me ride alongside you on your deliveries. No payment needed, just doing what is right." She studied him for a long moment, taking in the honest set of his jaw and the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work. Something in her chest loosened slightly, though she kept her expression neutral. "I leave in 10 minutes. If you have got a horse, you can follow. But I am warning you now, I make 8 stops and some of them require carrying bread upstairs or across yards. This is not easy work. Miss, I have herded cattle through thunderstorms and mended fences in August heat. I reckon I can handle delivering bread." The corner of his mouth lifted in a smile that transformed his entire face, and Maggie felt something flutter in her stomach that she firmly told herself was just hunger from skipping breakfast. True to his word, Fletcher was mounted on a handsome chestnut gelding when she climbed onto the wagon seat. The morning air still held a hint of coolness, though she knew by noon the Texas sun would be merciless. As they set off down the main street of Marfa, the horses' hooves clopping rhythmically on the hard, packed earth, she found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her. Their first stop was Mrs. Henderson's small adobe house at the edge of town. The elderly woman was 78 and had rheumatism so bad her hands were twisted like gnarled mesquite branches. Fletcher dismounted quickly and reached for the bread basket before Maggie could protest. "Allow me," he said simply, and she led him up the path to the door. "Mrs. Henderson's face lit up when she opened the door, her faded blue eyes moving between Maggie and Fletcher with interest. "And who is this handsome young man, Maggie dear?" "Fletcher Faulkner, madam," he said, removing his hat respectfully. "Just helping Miss Thompson with her deliveries today." "How wonderful! It is about time someone helped this poor girl. She has been working herself to the bone." Mrs. Henderson accepted the bread with grateful hands. "You take care of her, young man. She is one of the good ones." As they returned to the wagon, Maggie felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the climbing sun. "She means well," she said quickly. "Do not read anything into her comments." "Would not dream of it," Fletcher replied, but there was that smile again, gentle and knowing. The second stop was Mr. Calloway, a former cavalry officer who had lost his left leg in a skirmish with bandits 15 years prior. He lived in a room behind the feed store, and the stairs were narrow and steep. Fletcher carried the bread up carefully, and Maggie heard the two men talking about military service, Fletcher mentioning his own brief time in a volunteer militia unit before deciding the cowboy life suited him better. With each subsequent stop, Maggie found herself relaxing incrementally. Fletcher had a way with the elderly folks that surprised her. He listened to their stories with genuine interest, laughed at their jokes, and treated them with a dignity that made her throat tight. So many people ignored the old, dismissed them as burdens or relics of a bygone time. But Fletcher engaged with each person as though they were the most important individual he would meet that day. At their sixth stop, delivering to Miss Carver, a spinster schoolteacher forced into retirement by failing eyesight, the elderly woman invited them in for coffee. Maggie started to decline, mindful of her schedule, but Fletcher caught her eye and gave a small nod toward Miss Carver's hopeful expression. "We would be honored, Miss Carver," Maggie found herself saying, and the woman's face transformed with joy. They sat in her modest parlor, sipping strong coffee from delicate china cups that had crossed the country in a wagon train 40 years prior. Miss Carver told them about teaching 3 generations of Marfa children, about the town when it was just a water stop, about watching civilization slowly creep across the harsh desert landscape. "You two make a fine pair," Miss Carver said suddenly, her clouded eyes somehow seeing more than their physical forms. "I taught long enough to recognize when two souls are meant to find each other." Maggie nearly choked on her coffee, but Fletcher responded smoothly. "We have only just met, Miss Carver, but I will say that Miss Thompson is one of the most dedicated people I have had the pleasure of encountering." When they finally left, the sun was high and hot, and Maggie felt the weight of the morning's work in her shoulders. But there was also something lighter in her chest, something that had not been there when she woke in the dark hours before dawn. "Thank you," she said as they approached the final 2 stops, "for being kind to them. Many people just rush through deliveries like it is a chore to endure." Fletcher looked at her seriously. "My grandmother lived with us until she passed when I was 16. I remember how much it meant to her when people took time, really talked to her instead of just talking at her or around her. These folks have lived full lives, survived things we cannot imagine. The least we can do is treat them with respect." Something shifted in Maggie's perception of this stranger who had appeared in her life. He was not just being polite or trying to impress her. This was genuinely who he was. The last 2 deliveries went smoothly, and by the time they returned to the bakery, it was nearly noon. Maggie's stomach growled audibly as she climbed down from the wagon, and she laughed at her body's betrayal. "I've got stew left from last night," she found herself saying before she could second-guess the impulse. It is not much, but you have earned a meal after all that work." Fletcher's face showed surprise and pleasure. "I would be grateful for that, Miss Thompson." "Maggie," she corrected. "If you are going to help with deliveries, we should at least be on a first-name basis." "Then you should call me Fletcher," he said, and when their eyes met, she felt that flutter again, stronger this time. Inside the bakery's kitchen, she ladled stew into bowls while Fletcher washed his hands at the pump. The domestic simplicity of the moment struck her with unexpected force. She had been alone for so long, managing everything by herself, that having another person in the space felt both strange and comforting. As they ate, she told him about her father's condition, about the struggle to keep the bakery running, about the fear that gnawed at her in the quiet moments. Fletcher listened without interruption, and when she finished, he did not offer empty platitudes or false reassurances. "That is a heavy burden," he said instead. "But from what I have seen this morning, you are strong enough to carry it, and you do not have to carry it alone if you do not want to." "You are looking for ranch work," she reminded him. "You cannot spend your days delivering bread with me." "True," he acknowledged. "But until I find that position, I have got time. And even when I do find work, most ranches give cowboys a day off. I could help then." "Why?" The question came out more bluntly than she intended. "Why would you do that?" Fletcher set down his spoon and looked at her directly. "Honestly, because this morning was the most meaningful work I have done in months. Cattle do not care whether you show up or not, and ranch owners just see you as hired hands. But those people today, they mattered because we showed up. And because I have not been able to stop thinking about you since I first saw you loading that wagon in the dark." The confession hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Maggie's heart raced and she struggled to find words. Before she could respond, a weak call came from upstairs. "Maggie, is someone there?" "My father," she said, standing quickly. "I should check on him." "Of course," Fletcher said, rising as well. "I should be going anyway, but Maggie, if you want help tomorrow morning, I will be here." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him leave through the front door. Only when he was gone did she release the breath she had been holding and press her hand to her racing heart. The next morning, Fletcher was waiting when she emerged at 3:30 to light the bakery ovens. He did not say much, just helped her carry wood and water, following her lead as she went through the familiar routine. As the bread baked, filling the air with its warm, yeasty scent, they sat on the back step and watched the stars fade into dawn. "Tell me about being a cowboy," she said softly, not wanting to break the peaceful quiet but curious about his life. Fletcher leaned back against the doorframe, his profile outlined by the growing light. "It is hard work, often lonely. You spend weeks on cattle drives, sleeping on hard ground, eating dust. But there is something about being out there in all that open space, just you and the horse and the endless sky, makes you feel small and significant all at once." "You have family?" she asked. "Parents died when I was 17. Fever took them both within a week of each other. No siblings. I have been drifting from ranch to ranch since then, never really settling anywhere." He turned to look at her. "What about you?" "Always lived in Marfa, born here," she confirmed. "My parents came in '68, right after the town was established. Father wanted to open a bakery, thought a growing town would need good bread. He was right mostly. We have never been wealthy, but we have made a decent living." "You must have had suitors," Fletcher said, and there was a careful casualness to the question that made her smile. "A few," she admitted. "But running a bakery does not leave much time for courting, and the men who showed interest always seemed more taken with the idea of free bread than with me." "Then they were fools," Fletcher said quietly. "Any man would be lucky to have your attention." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the sincerity in his expression, This was not empty flattery or practiced charm. He meant every word. The days fell into a pattern after that. Fletcher helped with morning deliveries, his presence becoming as familiar as the sunrise. The elderly folks began expecting him, saving up stories to share, asking after him if he could not make a delivery. Mrs. Henderson started calling them her young couple, despite Maggie's protests. And Mr. Calloway gave Fletcher advice about courting that made both of them laugh in the afternoons. Fletcher searched for ranch work, making inquiries at spreads within riding distance of Marfa. Several offered him positions, but they were all too far away for daily travel. He turned them down without explaining why, but Maggie knew. He was staying for her. 3 weeks after their first delivery together, Fletcher found work at the Morrison Ranch, just 5 miles outside of town. The owner, a weathered man named Jack Morrison, needed help with fence mending and general ranch maintenance. The pay was modest but steady, and most importantly, Fletcher could ride back to town each evening. That night he appeared at the bakery after sunset, still dusty from the day's work. Maggie was cleaning the counters, her father already asleep upstairs, and her breath caught when she saw Fletcher's silhouette in the doorway. "I got the job," he said, stepping inside. "The Morrison place. I start tomorrow." "That is wonderful," she said, and meant it, even as something in her chest tightened at the thought of him not being there every morning. "I will still help with deliveries," he said quickly, reading her expression. "I told Mr. Morrison I needed to start at 7, not dawn. He was fine with it." "Fletcher, you do not have to do that. You will be exhausted." He crossed the space between them, stopping just close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes. "I want to. Those morning hours with you, they are the best part of my day. I am not giving them up unless you tell me you do not want me there." "I want you there," she whispered, and it was the most honest thing she had said in years. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek, rough from work but impossibly gentle. "I am falling for you, Maggie Thompson. I know it has only been a few weeks, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life." She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I am falling for you too. It terrifies me." "Why?" "Because what if you leave? What if you wake up one day and realize you want more than deliveries and a girl who smells like yeast and flour?" Fletcher's other hand came up to frame her face, and he waited until she opened her eyes before speaking. "I have been drifting for years, never finding a place that felt like home. But these past weeks, being with you, helping those people, it is the first time I have felt like I belong somewhere. I am not going anywhere, Maggie, not unless you send me away." She rose on her toes and kissed him, the decision made in her heart before her mind could overthink it. His arms came around her immediately, pulling her close, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and promise and hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably court you properly. Ask your father's permission, bring you flowers, all of that." Maggie laughed softly. "My father can barely get out of bed, and flowers die in this heat. But you can come to dinner tomorrow night if you want. Meet him properly, I mean. He has been asking about the cowboy who has been helping me." "I would be honored," Fletcher said, and kissed her again, softer this time, a promise sealed in the dusty quiet of the bakery. Dinner the next evening was a modest affair, but Maggie put extra effort into the meal, roasting chicken and making biscuits that were almost as good as her bread. Her father had managed to come downstairs with help, settling into his chair at the head of the small table with labored breathing but determined dignity. Fletcher arrived exactly on time, his hair still damp from washing at the boarding house, wearing his cleanest shirt. He shook her father's hand with firm respect and looked the older man in the eye. "Sir, I want to thank you for allowing me into your home. Your daughter is remarkable, and I count myself fortunate to know her." Thomas Thompson studied Fletcher with the assessing gaze of a man who had lived long enough to judge character quickly. "Maggie tells me you have been helping with deliveries, that you have turned down ranch work to stay close to town." "Yes, sir. I found a position at the Morrison place that allows me to continue helping." "Why?" The question was blunt and Maggie tensed, but Fletcher did not seem rattled. "Because the work matters, sir, and because I care deeply for your daughter. I know we have not known each other long, but I believe when you find something worth holding on to, you do not let it slip away." Her father was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "My wife, God rest her. I knew I would marry her the day I met her. Sometimes the heart knows before the head catches up. But I will tell you plainly, young man, my daughter is all I have in this world. If you hurt her, position or no position, I will find a way to make you regret it." "Father!" Maggie exclaimed, but Fletcher smiled. "I would expect nothing less, sir. And I give you my word, I will do everything in my power to make her happy." The evening went well after that, her father's protective edge softening as Fletcher answered questions about his life and plans. When Fletcher mentioned wanting to save money to perhaps buy land someday, her father's expression showed approval. As the weeks turned into months, Fletcher became woven into the fabric of Maggie's life so thoroughly that she could no longer imagine days without him. They fell into rhythms and patterns, small intimacies that felt more binding than any formal declaration. He learned how she liked her coffee, and she learned that he was terrible at small talk, but could discuss horses for hours. He discovered that she sang softly while kneading dough, and she discovered that he had a scar on his shoulder from being thrown against a fence post by an angry steer. The elderly folks on their delivery route watched the romance bloom with undisguised delight. Mrs. Henderson started embroidering pillowcases for when you two finally get married. And Mr. Calloway gave Fletcher increasingly detailed advice about ring shopping. In late November, as the desert air finally cooled and winter began its gentle approach, Fletcher asked Maggie to take a ride with him on Sunday afternoon. She packed a simple meal, and they rode out to a spot he had discovered, a small canyon where cottonwood trees grew along a seasonal creek. They spread a blanket on the ground and ate cold chicken and bread, talking about everything and nothing. When the meal was finished and they lay on their backs watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky, Fletcher turned on his side to face her. "I have been saving my wages," he said. "Every penny I do not need for basic necessities. Mr. Morrison says there is a parcel of land adjacent to his ranch that might be for sale come spring. 20 acres with a good water source. It would not be much at first, but I could build a house, start a small herd." Maggie's heart began to race. "That sounds wonderful, Fletcher. The thing is," he continued, reaching into his pocket, "I do not want to build a house for just myself. I want to build a home for us if you will have me." He opened his hand, revealing a simple gold band with a small stone that caught the sunlight. "It is not fancy," he said, and for the first time since she had known him he looked uncertain. "But it is honest, like I hope we are with each other. Maggie Thompson, will you marry me?" Tears blurred her vision as she nodded. "Yes, yes, of course yes." He slipped the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her with a passion that had been held carefully in check during their months of courtship, and she responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair as years of loneliness melted away in the warmth of being chosen, being loved. They set the wedding for February, giving Fletcher time to save more money and allowing Maggie to prepare what she could while still managing the bakery. Her father's health remained stable but fragile, and she worried about him constantly. The doctor visited weekly, adjusting medicines and offering gentle warnings that Thompson's heart could fail at any time. "I want to walk you down the aisle," her father told her one evening as she helped him eat his supper. "Or at least be there to see you married. After that, I can rest easy knowing you have someone to take care of you. You are not going anywhere for a long time," she said firmly, even as fear clutched at her heart. "You will be there for the wedding and for grandchildren and for many more years." He patted her hand with his weakened grip. "We will see, darling girl, we will see." Christmas came, and Fletcher spent it with them, bringing small gifts he had traded work for. A warm shawl for Maggie, tobacco for her father, and candy for the elderly folks on their route. They delivered bread on Christmas morning, finding that every single person had something waiting for them, small tokens of affection that spoke to how much these lonely people had come to care for the young couple who brightened their days. January brought cold winds and occasional frost, rare in Marfa but not unheard of. Fletcher continued working at the Morrison Ranch, where his reliability and skill had earned him increased responsibilities and a small raise in wages. The land he wanted was officially for sale, and Mr. Morrison had spoken to the owner on Fletcher's behalf, securing a promise that no one else would purchase it before Fletcher could raise the full amount. The wedding preparations were simple but heartfelt. Maggie sewed her own dress, white cotton with lace she had saved for years. Mrs. Henderson insisted on making the cake, despite her gnarled hands, and Miss Carver offered her parlor for the small reception. The local minister agreed to perform the ceremony in the church, and Mr. Calloway volunteered to stand up with Fletcher as his best man, an offer that moved the younger man to rare tears. On a clear February morning in 1884, with the sun warming the earth and wildflowers beginning to bloom in defiant patches across the desert, Maggie Thompson became Maggie Faulkner. Her father, through sheer force of will, walked her down the aisle on unsteady legs, and when he placed her hand in Fletcher's, the look of peace on his face was almost transcendent. The ceremony was brief but beautiful, their vows spoken with voices that trembled with emotion. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Fletcher kissed her with such tenderness that several elderly ladies in attendance wept openly. The reception was exactly what Maggie had wanted: small, warm, filled with people who genuinely cared for them. They cut Mrs. Henderson's lopsided but delicious cake, and Mr. Calloway gave a rambling toast about love and loyalty that somehow ended with horse training advice, making everyone laugh. As the sun began to set, Fletcher and Maggie prepared to leave for the boarding house, where the owner had given them a private room for their wedding night as a gift. Her father hugged her tightly, whispering, "Be happy, my darling girl. You deserve every happiness," and she felt tears slip down her cheeks as she held him. Their wedding night was everything first times should be: awkward and sweet and full of whispered reassurances and gentle laughter. They learned each other slowly, with patience and care, and when Maggie fell asleep in Fletcher's arms hours later, she felt more complete than she had known was possible. They moved into the small apartment above the bakery, the space that had once felt spacious for just Maggie now cozy with Fletcher's presence. He hung his few possessions on hooks, his extra shirts beside her dresses, his boots by the door next to her worn shoes. The domesticity of it made Maggie's heart swell. The routine of morning deliveries continued, now with Fletcher as her husband rather than her helper. The elderly folks rejoiced in the official union, treating the newlyweds with even more affection than before. Fletcher continued working at the Morrison Ranch, and slowly, steadily, their savings grew. In April, just 2 months after the wedding, Thomas Thompson passed peacefully in his sleep. Maggie found him in the morning when she went to bring him breakfast, his face relaxed and calm, finally free of pain. The grief crashed over her like a wave, and she sobbed in Fletcher's arms for hours, mourning the father who had been her anchor, her teacher, her friend. Fletcher handled all the arrangements, protecting her from the practical cruelties that follow death. The funeral was well attended. The entire delivery route of elderly folks present despite their various ailments. Testimony to how much Thomas Thompson had meant to the community through his daughter's continued care. In the weeks that followed, Maggie threw herself into work, kneading her grief into the bread dough, rising before dawn to avoid the empty space in the house where her father's presence had been. Fletcher led her process in her own way, offering quiet support and steady presence, never pushing her to talk before she was ready. One morning in May, as they loaded the wagon for deliveries, Maggie suddenly broke down again, this time not just with grief but with overwhelming gratitude. "I do not know how I would have survived this without you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You have been my strength when I had none." Fletcher pulled her close, holding her as she cried. "That is what marriage is, love. We take turns being strong for each other. You will do the same for me when my time comes to need it." By summer, Maggie had begun to heal, the sharp edges of grief softening into a tender ache. She started to find joy again in the small things. The way Fletcher kissed her before leaving for the ranch each morning, the satisfaction of perfectly risen bread, the grateful smiles of their elderly friends. In July, Fletcher came home with news that made both their hearts race. He had saved enough for the down payment on the land. The sale would be finalized by August, and they could begin building a house before winter. "We will still keep the bakery," he assured her. "I know how much it means to you, how much it meant to your father. But we will have our own place too, room to grow." That night, they lay in bed and planned their future in whispers, talking about the house they would build, the children they hoped to have, the life they were creating together from dust and determination and love. Construction began in September, with Fletcher doing much of the work himself on Sundays and whatever evenings he had energy. Friends from the Morrison Ranch helped, and even some of the elderly folks' grandchildren, young men passing through Marfa, pitched in when they heard what the couple had done for their grandparents. The house rose slowly from the Texas earth, simple, sturdy, built to last. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a good stove, a parlor with windows facing east to catch the morning light. Fletcher carved their initials into the doorframe before hanging the door, a permanent mark of their claim on this piece of the world. They moved in just before Christmas of 1884, sleeping on a mattress on the floor because they had not yet afforded a proper bed frame, but happier than either had dreamed possible. The bakery remained their livelihood, the morning deliveries their ministry, but this house was their sanctuary. On New Year's morning 1885, as they lay watching dawn light creep across the unfinished walls, Maggie told Fletcher she was pregnant. His whoop of joy echoed through the empty house, and he kissed her belly with such reverence that she laughed and cried at the same time. The pregnancy was difficult at times, the Texas heat of summer making her sick and swollen, but Fletcher was attentive and careful, taking over more of the physical labor at the bakery and on their delivery route. The elderly folks fussed over her endlessly, Mrs. Henderson knitting tiny clothes and Miss Carver reading all her books on childbirth to offer advice. In late August, during a thunderstorm that broke the heat and brought blessed rain to the parched land, Maggie delivered a healthy baby boy. They named him Thomas Fletcher Faulkner, honoring both her father and his father. And when Fletcher held his son for the first time, tears streaming down his face, Maggie knew with absolute certainty that she had married the right man. Life settled into a new rhythm after that, exhausting and fulfilling in equal measure. They hired a young woman named Sarah to help with the bakery a few mornings a week, giving Maggie time to rest and nurse the baby. Fletcher somehow managed to work the ranch, help with deliveries, and be a devoted father, running on determination and love and very little sleep. Thomas was a happy baby, quick to smile and curious about everything. The elderly folks on their route doted on him shamelessly, and Maggie often joked that their son had more grandparents than any child in Texas. In the spring of 1886, Fletcher bought his first cattle, just 10 head, but it was a start. He tended them in the evenings and on Sundays, building his herd slowly while maintaining his position at the Morrison Ranch. Mr. Morrison had become not just an employer but a friend and mentor, teaching Fletcher the business side of ranching and encouraging his ambitions. 2 years later, Maggie gave birth to a daughter, Grace Eleanor, named for both their mothers. She had her father's eyes and her mother's determination, making her opinions known from birth with a lusty cry that could wake the house. The years passed in a blur of work and laughter and the sweet chaos of raising children. The bakery thrived, the ranch grew, and through it all, they maintained their morning delivery route. It was harder now with 2 young children, but they made it work. Sometimes the kids came along, bundled in the wagon, and the elderly folks loved having fresh young voices in their homes. Mrs. Henderson passed peacefully in 1888, leaving her embroidered pillowcases to Maggie with a note that read, "For the woman who made my final years less lonely. Use them well and think of me." Maggie cried for days, but she also felt gratitude that she had been there, that she had made a difference in the old woman's life. Mr. Calloway followed 2 years later, and then Miss Carver the year after that. Each loss hurt, but Maggie and Fletcher continued the deliveries, finding new elderly folks who needed help, maintaining the tradition that had brought them together and remained central to who they were as a couple. In 1891, Fletcher had saved enough to buy the Morrison Ranch, when Jack Morrison decided to retire and move to San Antonio to live with his daughter. It was a significant purchase, stretching their finances to the limit, but it represented the full realization of Fletcher's dreams. The cowboy who had drifted into Marfa 8 years earlier now owned land, cattle, and a thriving business. But success never changed who they were at their core. They still woke before dawn to bake bread, still made their deliveries to those who could not leave their homes, still treated every person with dignity and care. Their children grew up learning that wealth was not measured in land or cattle, but in relationships and service, in showing up for people even when it was inconvenient. Thomas grew into a serious boy with his grandfather's quiet strength and his father's way with animals. Grace was spirited and clever, already showing signs of her mother's business acumen. In 1893, they were joined by another son, William, and 3 years later by a second daughter, Rose. The house that Fletcher had built was expanded twice to accommodate their growing family, wings added on each side, but the original doorframe with their carved initials remained the heart of it. On Sunday evenings, when work was done and the children were in bed, Maggie and Fletcher would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over their land, holding hands like the young people they had been when they first met. "You ever regret it?" Maggie asked one evening in 1898, 15 years into their marriage. The drifting life, the freedom of being unattached. Fletcher looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Not for one single second. You and the children, this life we have built, It is everything I never knew I needed. You remember what I told you that first day, that I had not felt like I belonged anywhere. That changed the moment I saw you loading that wagon in the dark. I was home. I just did not know it yet. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the gesture as comfortable and familiar as breathing. I love you more now than I did the day we married. I did not think that was possible, but it is true. Same, he said simply, kissing the top of her head. Every single day I love you more. Their oldest children began to take over some of the delivery route as they entered their teenage years, learning the same lessons of service and compassion their parents had taught by example. Thomas, at 16, had a particular connection with the elderly men who had been soldiers or ranchers, listening to their stories with the same attentive respect his father had shown years before. Grace, at 14, inherited her mother's baking skills and her warm manner with people. She often brought extra treats she had made herself, experimenting with recipes and bringing small moments of sweetness to difficult lives. The bakery became known throughout the region, not just for the quality of the bread, but for the character of the family that ran it. People traveled from neighboring towns to buy from Thompson's bakery, the name unchanged out of respect for Maggie's father, and many commented that you could taste the love baked into every loaf. The ranch prospered under Fletcher's management. He was known as a fair employer, paying decent wages and treating his cowboys with respect. Several of the young men who worked for him went on to start their own spreads, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about managing land and livestock with care. In 1901, on a hot July day, Maggie and Fletcher celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a surprise party, inviting everyone from town, including the current elderly folks on the delivery route and several of their grown children who had heard stories about the couple's kindness. As Maggie looked around at the crowd gathered on their land, at the house built from nothing, at the children who represented their love made manifest, at the man who had ridden into her life and never left, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Fletcher found her during a quiet moment, pulling her aside while guests mingled. "What are you thinking about, Mrs. Faulkner?" "About that morning you appeared out of the dawn offering to help," she said. "About how my whole life changed in that moment. About how the luckiest day of my life was when you rode beside me." He smiled, that same smile that had stolen her heart 2 decades earlier. "And rode into your heart, straight into it," she confirmed, "and never left." He kissed her then in front of everyone, a kiss that was both chaste and full of promise, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The years continued to pass, bringing the usual mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. They buried more elderly friends, welcomed grandchildren as their own children married, and watched Marfa grow from a small desert town into a more established community. Through it all, through every season and change, Maggie and Fletcher remained each other's constant. They still rose before dawn to bake bread, though their bodies moved slower now. They still made deliveries to the housebound elderly, though their children and now their older grandchildren often did the heavy lifting. In 1910, on their 40th anniversary, they sat in rocking chairs on their porch, surrounded by children and grandchildren. Thomas had taken over the ranch operations. Grace ran the bakery with her own daughter helping. William was a teacher in Marfa. Rose had married a lawyer and moved to El Paso but visited frequently. "We did all right," Fletcher said softly, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Better than all right," Maggie replied, reaching for his hand, the gesture as natural as it had been 40 years earlier. "We built a life that mattered. We helped people. We raised good children. We loved each other well. Still do," Fletcher said, "Still love you more than I can say, Maggie Faulkner." "And I love you," she replied. "Every day, every moment I love you." As the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had found each other by chance and stayed together by choice. The bread deliveries that had brought them together had become a family legacy, a tradition of service and compassion that would continue long after they were gone. In their 70s now, they still sometimes rode out together to the spot where Fletcher had proposed, spreading a blanket under the cottonwood trees and talking about the life they had shared. They spoke of the elderly folks they had helped, many of whom had died with less loneliness because someone had shown up for them. They spoke of their children, all good people raising good families. They spoke of the ranch and the bakery, both thriving under the next generation's care. But mostly, they spoke of love, of finding it unexpectedly, nurturing it carefully, and watching it grow into something that shaped not just their lives but the lives of everyone they touched. On a quiet morning in the spring of 1915, as they loaded bread into the wagon for the delivery route, now helped by a grandson who had his great-grandfather Thompson's gentle way with the elderly, Fletcher paused to look at Maggie. She was 72 now, her hair more silver than brown, her face lined with years of hard work and laughter. To him, she was just as beautiful as the young woman loading bread in the dark all those years ago. "What?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he said. "That I was looking out my boarding house window that morning, that I decided to offer help, that you said yes." "I am the lucky one," she countered. "You gave me partnership, support, love, everything I did not even know to ask for." "We are both lucky," he compromised and kissed her softly, the gesture still capable of making her heart flutter even after all these years. They climbed onto the wagon, Fletcher still strong enough to handle the reins, and set off through the streets of Marfa as the sun rose behind them. The bread was fresh, the morning was beautiful, and they were together. After more than 4 decades of marriage, they still found joy in this simple routine, in showing up for people who needed them, in being a team. Their grandson rode alongside on his own horse, learning the route, learning the stories, learning what it meant to serve with joy. He watched his grandparents with awe, seeing the easy affection between them, the way they moved in harmony born of years of practice, the way they still looked at each other like young lovers despite the decades between then and now. This was love, he realized. Not just the dramatic moments or the grand gestures, but this, showing up every day, doing the work together, choosing each other over and over again. His grandparents had built something remarkable not just in land and business, but in the strength of their partnership. And he hoped to find something even half as good for himself someday. As they made their deliveries that morning, stopping at houses where new generations of elderly folks waited, Maggie and Fletcher continued to do what they had always done. Show up with bread and kindness, listen to stories, offer dignity and respect. It was not flashy work, not particularly profitable, but it mattered. And at the end of the day, when they returned home and Fletcher helped Maggie down from the wagon with the same careful courtesy he had shown for 43 years, when they walked into their house hand in hand, when they sat down to a meal surrounded by family, they knew with absolute certainty that they had lived a life worth living. The cowboy who had ridden beside her had indeed ridden into her heart, and there he had stayed, constant and true, through every joy and sorrow, every triumph and trial. Together, they had created something beautiful, a love that served not just themselves but their entire community, a legacy that would outlive them in the hearts of the people they had touched. And that, Maggie thought as she fell asleep in her husband's arms that night, was the truest measure of a life well lived. Not what you accumulated, but whom you loved and how you served. They had loved deeply and served faithfully, and the world was brighter for their presence in it. Years continued to pass in gentle succession, and though their bodies grew frailer, their spirits remained strong. In 1920, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, a remarkable milestone that brought people from across Texas to honor the couple who had quietly changed so many lives. The celebration was held at the ranch, and the mayor of Marfa gave a speech about how the Faulkners represented the best of what community meant. Former delivery route recipients, now themselves elderly, shared stories of how regular visits from Maggie and Fletcher had kept them going during their darkest times. Cowboys who had worked for Fletcher spoke of his fairness and mentorship. Customers from the bakery testified to the consistent quality and the warm welcome they always received. But the most moving tribute came from their own children and grandchildren, who spoke of parents and grandparents who practiced what they preached, who taught by example that a life of service and love was the highest calling anyone could aspire to. As Maggie and Fletcher sat together, listening to these testimonials, they held hands and exchanged glances full of shared memories and continued affection. They had started with so little: a dying father, a failing bakery, uncertain futures. But together, they had built an empire not of wealth but of relationships, not of power but of service. In their final years, when age made the early mornings too difficult and the delivery route too demanding, they finally turned the bakery fully over to Grace and her children. But they still went on deliveries sometimes, riding in the wagon rather than driving it, visiting old friends and making new ones among the next generation of elderly folks. Fletcher passed first, in his sleep at age 83, his hand in Maggie's as it had been for over 50 years of marriage. She grieved deeply but without regret, knowing that they had used their time together well, that they had loved fully, that they had made a difference. She lived 2 more years, spending her days with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a matriarch who had built a family on foundations of love and service. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch and remember. The morning Fletcher had appeared in the dawn offering help, their first kiss in the bakery, their wedding day, the births of their children, the 1,000 small moments that had woven together into a life of meaning. When Maggie Faulkner passed at 85, the entire town of Marfa mourned. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, testimony to the lives she and Fletcher had touched. The bakery closed for the day, the first time in its 60-year history, out of respect. She was buried beside Fletcher under cottonwood trees on their land, the spot where he had proposed so many years before. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription that captured everything they had been. Together in service, together in love, together forever. The delivery route continued, now handled by their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a tradition passed down through generations. The bakery thrived, still bearing the Thompson name, still serving the community with the same commitment to quality and kindness. The ranch remained in the family, managed with the same principles Fletcher had established. But more than the businesses or the property, the true legacy Maggie and Fletcher left behind was the example of their lives. That love could grow from unexpected encounters. That service to others enriched your own life. That partnership and mutual respect formed the foundation of lasting happiness. And that showing up day after day, choosing each other and choosing kindness, was the greatest achievement anyone could aspire to. Their story became part of Marfa's history, told and retold to new generations. The cowboy who rode beside the baker's daughter and into her heart became a romantic legend, but those who had known them understood it was more than romance. It was commitment, partnership, sacrifice, and joy intertwined, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together towards something greater than themselves. And on quiet mornings in Marfa, when the sun rose over the desert and bread baked in Thompson's bakery ovens, when wagons loaded with fresh loaves made their way through town to deliver to the housebound elderly, the spirit of Maggie and Fletcher Faulkner lived on. Not in monuments or plaques, but in continued acts of service, in bread broken and shared, in the simple dignity of showing up for people who needed someone to remember they existed. That was their legacy. That was their love story, not perfect but real, not easy but worthwhile. A cowboy and a baker's daughter who found each other in the harsh Texas landscape and created an oasis of kindness that flourished long after they were gone. They had started with bread and ended with a dynasty, but more importantly, they had started with loneliness and ended with love that multiplied and spread, touching countless lives across generations. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually hear the story. How Nana Maggie delivered bread to housebound elders, how Papa Fletcher rode beside her and into her heart, how from that simple beginning grew a family and a community bound together by service and love. The details might blur with time, dates might be forgotten, but the essential truth remained, that two people had chosen each other and chosen service, and in doing so had created something beautiful and lasting. The bread continued to rise each morning in the ovens, golden and fragrant, sustenance for body and soul. The deliveries continued, bringing not just food but companionship to those who needed it most. And the love story continued too, in the marriages of their descendants, in the way they treated strangers and friends alike, in the values they passed down through the generations. Maggie Thompson, who once feared she would spend her life alone managing a failing bakery, had instead found partnership and purpose. Fletcher Faulkner, who had drifted aimlessly from ranch to ranch seeking something he could not name, had found home and meaning. Together, they had discovered that the most extraordinary lives are often built from ordinary moments made sacred by love and intention. Their story was not one of dramatic rescues or grand adventures, though it had its share of challenges and triumphs. It was instead the story of showing up day after day for each other and for their community. It was the story of bread delivered with kindness, of elderly folks given dignity, of children raised to serve, of a love that grew deeper with each passing year. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The sun set over the Faulkner ranch as it had thousands of times before, painting the sky in brilliant colors that would fade to star-filled darkness. The house stood solid and welcoming, expanded and remodeled over the years, but still bearing the original doorframe with two sets of initials carved deep into the wood. A permanent reminder of the day Fletcher had finished their home, of the promise implicit in that gesture, of the life they had built within those walls. In the town of Marfa, Texas, the legacy lived on. Not in statues or museums, but in bread that rose each morning in deliveries made with care, in a community that remembered what two people had taught them. That service was sacred, that love was a choice made daily, and that the most meaningful lives were those lived for others. This was the story of how a baker's daughter and a drifting cowboy found each other in the Wild West of 1883, how they built a life together through hard work and devotion, and how their love rippled outward, touching hundreds of lives and creating a legacy that would endure for generations. It was a story without dramatic shootouts or gold strikes or frontier justice, but it was no less remarkable for its quiet beauty. It was simply the story of two people who loved well, served faithfully, and left the world brighter than they found it. And in the end, no story could be more important than that.